On a sweltering afternoon behind barbed wire in the American Midwest, a group of Japanese prisoners of war stood silently as a truck rattled into their camp. They expected the usual supplies, orders, perhaps another reminder of defeat. Instead, a guard lifted a metal lid, and a wave of cold air escaped. Inside were tubs of ice cream, pale and smooth, already beginning to sweat in the summer heat. For men who had crossed the Pacific believing America was a starving, decadent nation on the brink of collapse, this single frozen luxury struck harder than any interrogation in that moment. Many Japanese POWs understood something profound and terrifying. They had been fighting an enemy whose material power was almost unimaginable. Capture and shock during World War II. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was shameful and that capture was worse than death. Imperial military doctrine emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and loyalty to the emperor above all else. Many soldiers believed that American captivity meant torture or execution, when Japanese prisoners instead found themselves alive, fed, and treated according to international conventions. The psychological shock was immense. From Guadalcanal to the Aleutian Islands, from Saipan to the Philippines, Japanese POWs were shipped thousands of miles to camps scattered across the continental United States. These camps, located in places like Arizona, Texas, Wisconsin, and Mississippi, were often former civilian conservation corps sites or hastily converted military facilities. Compared to the starvation, disease, and chaos of the Pacific battlefield, they felt unreal. But nothing symbolized that unreality more sharply than food. Hunger in the Imperial Army. To understand the impact of ice cream, one must first understand hunger in the Japanese military. By the later years of the war, Japan's supply lines were collapsing under American submarine attacks and aerial bombardment. Soldiers routinely survived on half rations or less. Rice, central to Japanese identity, was often replaced with millet, barley, or nothing at all. Meat was rare. Sugar was nearly non-existent. Fresh vegetables were a luxury. On isolated islands, starvation killed as many Japanese soldiers as combat. Diaries recovered after the war describe men boiling grass, chewing tree bark, and fighting rats for scraps. Some resorted to cannibalism. In this context, the idea of milk, sugar, and frozen desserts was almost mythical. Ice cream was not simply food. It was excess. It was proof of abundance. First encounters with American abundance. American POW camps were required to follow the Geneva Convention, which mandated that prisoners receive the same rations as the captor nation's own troops. For the United States, this meant meals that included bread, meat, coffee, fresh fruit, and desserts. Japanese prisoners, accustomed to a monotonous and dwindling diet, were stunned by the variety. Former POW accounts frequently mention white bread as their first shock. In Japan, bread was rare and associated with Westerners. In the camps it was served daily, soft and plentiful. There was meat almost every day, often canned but sometimes fresh. There was sugar in tea, there was coffee, and sometimes, astonishingly, there was ice cream. Ice cream required more than ingredients. It required refrigeration, transportation, electricity, and a massive industrial infrastructure. For Japanese prisoners, many of whom came from rural villages without electricity, this was evidence of a technological gulf far wider than they had been told. The industrial gap revealed. Japanese wartime propaganda portrayed America as decadent, lazy, and spiritually weak. The narrative suggested that Americans relied on machines because they lacked discipline and courage. Yet those same machines were now producing endless food, cold storage, and comforts even for enemy soldiers. Ice cream exposed the lie. It demonstrated that American industry could not only supply millions of its own soldiers across the globe but also provide luxuries to captured enemies on home soil. The United States was producing more steel, more fuel, more ships, more aircraft, and more food than Japan could imagine. The frozen desert in a POW camp was a small output of an enormous system. Many prisoners later wrote that this realization broke their faith in eventual victory. They had believed Japan's hardships were shared by its enemies. Ice cream proved otherwise. Psychological warfare without intent. Interestingly, the United States did not distribute ice cream as psychological warfare. It was simply part of military logistics and morale-boosting practices common in American camps. Yet its impact on Japanese POWs was profound. Some prisoners initially suspected trickery. They worried the food was poisoned or that accepting such luxury would bring shame. Others ate cautiously, overwhelmed by sweetness they had not tasted in years. A few became ill, their bodies unaccustomed to rich dairy and sugar after prolonged malnutrition. But over time, ice cream became a symbol of something larger, a world where resources seemed endless, where suffering was not universal, and where the enemy's strength was rooted in factories, farms, and systems rather than sheer willpower alone. Changing views of the enemy food altered perceptions. Guards who served ice cream did not fit the image of brutal American devils described by Japanese officers. Many guards were young, polite, sometimes curious about Japan. Some attempted broken Japanese phrases, others shared newspapers or explained baseball rules. Ice cream days became moments of uneasy humanity. Prisoners and guards alike recognized the absurdity of war in those brief minutes of shared normalcy. The frozen treat did not erase resentment or shame. but it complicated hatred. For some prisoners, this was deeply unsettling. They had been trained to dehumanize the enemy. Ice cream, of all things, reintroduced the idea that Americans lived comfortably, laughed easily, and expected abundance as a norm. Re-education and realization. By 1944 and 1945, American authorities began re-education programs in POW camps, especially as it became clear that Japan would lose the war. These programs included newspapers, lectures, and discussions about democracy, industry, and post-war reconstruction. Ice cream had already taught the lesson more effectively than any pamphlet. Japanese prisoners compared stories. Some came from cities destroyed by bombing, where children starved and factories lay in ruins. Others came from rural areas stripped of young men and resources. All contrasted that reality with American farms that produced surplus milk, sugar, and cream even during wartime. The industrial gap was no longer abstract. It was cold, sweet, and undeniable. Cultural meaning of ice cream. In pre-war Japan, ice cream existed but was rare and expensive, largely confined to urban elites. Wartime rationing made it virtually disappear. Milk itself was scarce, especially for adults. For many soldiers, tasting ice cream in captivity was their first experience of it. The sensation was overwhelming. Prisoners described the shock of cold on the tongue, the richness of dairy fat, the intense sweetness of sugar. Some laughed involuntarily. Others cried in private, ashamed that defeat had led them to such pleasure. The dessert became entwined with conflicting emotions: humiliation, relief, wonder, and grief for a homeland that could not provide the same. A silent admission of defeat. Not all prisoners accepted the lesson. Hardline loyalists rejected American food and accused others of weakness. There were instances of internal violence within camps, where pro-war factions attacked those seen as collaborators or Americanized. Yet even among the most rigid, doubt crept in. Ice cream was not a weapon, but it eroded certainty. It suggested that Japan's vision of self-sufficient spiritual superiority could not compete with America's material reality. For a war increasingly decided by production numbers, ships launched, planes built, tons of food shipped, the message was devastating. After the war, when the war ended and prisoners were repatriated to Japan, many carried memories of American camps that conflicted sharply with their ruined homeland. Japan in 1945 faced starvation, homelessness, and devastation. Cities lay in ashes. Food shortages persisted for years. Some former POWs later admitted that their time in American camps, including experiences like eating ice cream, prepared them psychologically for defeat. They had already seen what Japan was up against. In post-war Japan, as American occupation forces introduced new foods and consumer culture, ice cream slowly returned, this time as a symbol of recovery rather than humiliation. For a generation of former soldiers, however, its taste always carried echoes of barbed wire and revelation. More than a dessert, history often focuses on battles, generals, and treaties. Yet sometimes the most powerful truths emerge in small, human moments. A spoonful of ice cream in a POW camp revealed the true nature of World War II as an industrial conflict, one won not only by courage or sacrifice, but by factories, farms, logistics, and energy. For Japanese prisoners, that frozen luxury shattered propaganda, exposed imbalance, and quietly answered the question they had been afraid to ask: how could Japan possibly win? In the end, ice cream did what bombs and bullets could not. It made defeat undeniable, not through force, but through abundance.